For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ryan. I'm the youth pastor here at Palms. And just to kind of introduce me, I've been here at Palms for a while. I was the pastor of discipleship for a while. And then about, a year ago, a little over a year ago, I came in and took over the youth because there was a need there. So what I really want to kind of do today is really kind of two things. One, I want to almost act as an ambassador, a multi-generational ambassador, kind of like a generational spy for somebody who is not a part of this generation, but spends a lot of enormous time with them in a given week, to provide you just some kind of insights, things that not just me, but our entire youth ministry has observed over the last year about this generation. But I also want to kind of do a second thing, which is kind of offer a defense for them. I think it's kind of common, but generally older generations tend to kind of vile up-and-coming generations. And it's large in part because they don't understand it, right? So they do things different, they see the world different, but you would expect them to, right? Every generation is unique. Yes. Every generation has different contexts that they grow up in. So they interpret the world differently. And this isn't anything new. So what I really kind of want to do is just give you 4 of our biggest observations. And our only observation is just the biggest that we would want to communicate to you as a ministry team. Does that make sense? Fair enough? The first thing I just want to kind of inform you, or at least touch on, is the uniqueness of this generation. This is a very unique generation, and every generation is unique. In Matthew chapter 11, starting, I think it's in verse 16, speaking of his own generation, Jesus kind of asks this rhetorical question. He says, what can I compare this generation? To what can I compare this generation? And Jesus generally, when he's providing any sort of comparison or teaching, he draws from Old Testament stories or characters or symbols. But when it comes to his own generation, he doesn't do that. He uses these very general comparisons because of the uniqueness of his own generation. He eventually actually just kind of concludes his generation as a bunch of dissatisfied, spoiled children, is essentially how he comes. Which is not, I wouldn't say is true of the generation I'm talking about today. But every generation has its uniqueness. One other thing, I just want to kind of go through some of their uniqueness. And mainly in the things that I think are kind of tragic. What's uniquely tragic to this generation. This is the first generation in history where the majority of the generation are struggling with some sort of mental health condition. 3 out of 4 state that they are dealing with stress that they do not feel that they are properly equipped to cope with. 1 out of 3 suffer from some form of chronic anxiety disorder. 1/4 of the generation suffers with severe depression. This generation has the highest suicide attempt rate of any generation for as long as they've actually taken data on it. 12%. 12% of this generation will attempt suicide at some point, right? This is such a problem that they have now been dubbed the depressed generation. Every generation kind of gets their title, right? Millennials, what you guys remember ours? What was ours? The entitled generation, right? I'm a millennial. We were called the entitled generation. Gen Xers, what were you all? The forgotten generation, right? They're the depressed generation. That is how bad their mental health crisis is in this generation. And a lot of academics and psychologists have been trying to kind of peel it back and figure out, what are some contributing factors to this. And here are some of their observations that they found direct correlations to. This is the first generation in history where half of the Gen Zers, they call them the Zoomers, where half of the Zoomers are raised in single-parent homes. Majority of which are by, large majority is by single mothers, 80%. So about half the generation, 80% at least of half the generation are being raised by single mothers. Of the other half that are in a dual-parent home, a good portion of that is mixed or blended families, right? Like stepmom, stepdad. And the point being is that the traditional nuclear family, the one where you have, you are raised in the same home by your biological mom and dad, is not there anymore. That is the minority. That is not normal to that generation. That's the exception at this point. Unlike previous generations. One out of every 4 know somebody extremely close to them who is battling a drug addiction, particularly meth and the fentanyl in particular. So a quarter knows somebody very close to them battling a drug addiction. And by close, they define that by mom, dad, brother, sister, somebody like that. This is the first generation to grow up not really knowing a season of national peace. Think about it this way. The oldest Zoomer was 4 years old when 9/11 happened. And until just a couple years ago, right, we just kind of got into a season of national peace. But they've grown up their entire life not really knowing a season of national peace in this country. This is the first generation to grow up with social media as an active element or a primary element of their social interaction, but more probably importantly, their social development. Right? So, I mean, when social media came out, I was an NCO in the Marine Corps, gone back from, my first combat deployment before that ever became a thing, and then it was MySpace. Y'all remember MySpace? Come on, let's bring MySpace back. They always have those T-shirts, "MySpace ruined my life." But looking back, MySpace was way better than anything they got now. But this current generation, that formed their social interaction and their social development. It is a primary source of their social development, and they've actually done any further correlations, particularly with apps like Instagram, that's very visually and picture-based. They say about 64% use Instagram on a daily basis, and they have found a strong correlation of a massive increase of depression, particularly among the younger females, for those who are on Instagram. Because it never stops, right? Like we talk about, previous generations bullying, right? We all dealt with bullying. Every generation has dealt with the bullying, right? But we never had to deal with it following us home 24/7. Waking up, something happens at school, and then all through the day you're seeing the posts, you're seeing the comments. You try to turn it off. You wake up in the morning, you got 98 notifications. There was actually a couple instances of that with our youth this week, struggling with that. Because it's not just anymore individual bullying, it's now corporate bullying. And now what we found this week is that you have entire cities are able to now jump on stages and bully certain kids. It's a problem. This is also, this generation placed climate change as their biggest fear. Now, it's irrelevant what your political position on that is, whether you think that is right or wrong. The point and what's relevant is that they believe it. Right? So previous generations, we've had, it was communism. That was the greatest existential threat, or it was the Soviet Union. For my generation, it was Al-Qaeda and terrorism, right? For them, it's the weather, right? And we were able to always, kind of do things that we felt like we were contributing to helping resolve the problem. How do you combat the weather, right? And there's all these ideas, but, frankly, a lot of those ideas are without crushing and putting everybody into some sort of depression doesn't seem very viable, right? So my point is this: are we really that surprised that this generation is as anxious, stressed, and depressed as they are? Right? I'm trying to just create a baseline of context for them, for us who do not belong to them, because I think this is a beauty. I think a sign of a very healthy church is a multi-generational church. And if done well and received well, that kind of church can be very impactful for the kingdom of God. But if we don't understand it properly, it could also be a source of a lot of tension and friction in the church, right? We always have those little, the older generation likes their music. You got this new up-and-coming generation, and they like their music, right? And trying to find this multi-generational blend of how we conduct worship and how we conduct ministry and the proper way to do that. But really the point I want to say is that every generation is so unique that while we're fighting the same war and we're maybe fighting the same enemy, the enemy's not using the same tactics. And you can't ask them to fight it the same way. The powerful army in Europe prior to World War II was France. And France, coming out of World War I, had kind of built this entire military complex based off of preparing to fight the next World War the way they fought the previous World War. Germany, when they invaded Poland, France declared war shortly after on Germany. Germany, realizing that they were outmatched, outnumbered, developed a new tactic called the Blitzkrieg. You guys all familiar with this in history? with this new tactic, they were able to essentially rout the most powerful army in Europe within a matter of about 6 weeks. And this is what I want. This is my point: is that we cannot fight this generational fight that they're fighting the same way we fought our fight when we were in youth. If we have developed this defense in the church where we decided to fight this fight our way, Satan's going to blitzkrieg us. And in fact, I would say he's blitzkrieging us now, which we'll get into here in a second. So the first thing I just wanted to let you know, this generation is very unique. They are not like us. They do not have, there's some general principles that are the same, but it manifests in a very unique way. The front lines have shifted and the tactics have shifted. One of the places where I feel tactics have shifted the most has been in identity. And I don't mean just general identity as a generation, but Christian identity. Even within our own Christian youth. If you want to follow with me, I want to take you all the way back to the very first 3 chapters of your Bible. I'm going to bounce around kind of quickly, but if you want to move there. But it kind of lays some groundwork here. In Genesis 1:27, this is what we would call kind of the climax of creation week. This is when God creates mankind. And in Genesis 1:27, he says, "Now let us make man in our image." So in the image, he created them both male and female. Okay, we've all heard this verse before. That concept, in the image of God, the Imago Dei, is such a formidable and important theological concept for believers. That is supposed to be the governing truth to which we not only see and treat people, but how we also see and treat ourselves. When you're getting cut off in traffic and you start cussing somebody out on the road, you're not just cussing somebody out. You are cussing out somebody who is fearfully and wonderfully made in God's image. When you're seeing somebody you don't know hungry on the side of the road, that's somebody who is fearfully and wonderfully made in God's image who is hungry. Right? So it was supposed to be the governing truth of how we see people, how we treat people, but also the way that we see and treat ourselves. So that when you cut somebody off in traffic and they're cussing you out, you're saying, I hear the words they're calling me, but that's not me. That's not my identity. My identity is found in God's image. Does that make sense? What's interesting here, though, in Genesis 1, so God says, let's make them in our image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. But then you fast forward to Genesis chapter 2. Adam is doing ministry. He's kind of, the text in the Hebrew is a little bit stronger. You almost get the sense that Adam is failing in his purpose in his ministry. And he says that I need help, but no suitable helper is found. So God comes in and he gives him a wife. We all know this story, right? There's this really beautiful scene of essentially this kind of odd, but beautiful wedding ceremony that comes in. Right after God presents his wife to him, it then says, this is in verse 23, it says, then Adam names her, his wife, woman, for she came out of man, out of a side of man. Now, this question, you back up, was created in the image of man or the image of God? And now you have Adam here naming her out of the image of himself. Okay? Fast forward the very next chapter in the garden, and this is when we get what we'd call the fall. This is generally what it's called. This is the big failure. This is when the woman is tempted by Satan. So question, why do you think Satan chose to go after the woman and not the man? Can I just provide you my personal opinion? I think at that particular time, the woman had the weaker identity. She had the weaker identity. She had the identity that was being drawn from Adam. Adam was drawing his identity from God. She had the weaker identity. In fact, you see this in verse 4 through 5, Satan actually tempts the woman with a new identity. He says, hey, you won't die if you eat of that. In fact, your eyes will be open and you'll become what? You read it there? Like God. You'll get this whole new identity. You won't be defined and identified by the men. You'll be defined now, you'll have the identity of being God, like God. He tempts her with a new identity, and she bites off on it. Yeah. And then it doesn't turn out that way. So here's my point, though, is that right now I feel like our youth, they're in a place where they're first drawing a lot of their identity from the world and the men and the women of the world. Social media, I mean, how many clicks do I get? How many likes do I get? Man, on Instagram, you see my picture? Do you like my picture? Validate me, because that's where my value and my dignity is drawn from. My identity is being drawn based off of what other people say about me. It is not being drawn from where it's supposed to be, which is anchored in the identity of God's image. But I think Satan is doing something even further right now in this generation. Because beyond just pulling identity from the world, Satan is now doing his blitzkrieg the same way he blitzkrieged the woman in the garden. He's coming in and he's saying, hey, generation, in fact, you can be like God. You can usurp his rightful place as the definer of you, and you get to define yourself. You become like God. It's the exact same model. Satan hasn't changed that tactic. He's just applied it to something different. For my generation, it was sexual identity. That's where he was attacking. For this generation, it seems to be gender identity. But identity is identity. It's nothing new. But he's blitzkrieging in a new way. But I think there's also something very interesting with this narrative, because Eve, obviously, there's a failure, there's a mistake. God comes down, they're hiding from him, and he curses the serpent, then he curses the woman, right? He essentially says, because you've done this, things are going to get very difficult for you now. But he doesn't just leave it at a curse. He also gives her the blessing of a promise. He says that out of you, you're going to produce a seed, and that seed is going to be the one who makes all this better. It's going to make all this right. He's going to crush the head of the serpent who tempted you into this. Amen. Right? So, but there's something interesting. Look at verse 20. What does Adam then do coming out of that? He renames her. She's no longer woman. He renames her Eve, because she was going to be the mother of all the living. My point being is that coming out of a failure, out of that mistake, he then gave her a new identity that was no longer anchored on his character. It wasn't anchored on her character, and it wasn't even anchored on her failure. It was anchored on the promise of God. Right? And that same promise, this is what we'd call probably the oldest messianic text, the first messianic text in your Bible. That promised seed would come in the form of Jesus of Nazareth. And he would come and completely reform and reshape all the identity of us. One of the primary ministries of Jesus was to show us that we are not who we think we are. Both in a negative sense, that we are not the gods of our own lives, but also that we're not the trash that we feel we are. That we are no longer defined and draw our identity in our mistakes, our failures, our traumas, or what the rest of the world tells us. You are now defined in the promise, in the grace, and the mercy of Jesus Christ. That's the identity we're supposed to have as believers. And I just can't help but feel that our youth right now have this vastly incomplete identity in Christ. And they have incomplete identity in Christ because I feel like we have had an incomplete identity in Christ. We have not given them a good example. If you were to ask most believers, what do you think the gospel is? Describe to me what the gospel is. Most would say, well, Jesus came, he loved me, he died for my sin, he saved me from hell, I get to go now be in heaven and have eternal life forever, right? And that is absolutely 100% true. And for many of you, that one fact has been enough to drive you to here to church, to serve, to worship, to be faithful to the best of your ability in your life, right? That one fact. But he came to do far more. I have in the back here, I highlighted on the right there. This is such a focus for us in youth right now that as a series, we as a youth are going through the 10 factors of identity formation. There's 10 factors that where we draw our identity from. The gospel I just described is all but just, that's your future, that's your destiny, which is certainly a huge part of it, but we're missing the other 9. So when we're drawing our identity in Christ from just one of those 10 factors, we're searching the world to define the other 9 for us. And that's how so many, I feel like, we've been living our life. We got these shirts. You could see them in the back. There's a couple variations, right? We started putting all these different identities that Christ or that Scripture gives believers. I ran out of room. There's so many. I ran out of room on the shirt. I couldn't put any more on there, right? But there's all these identities, loved, saint, redeemed, sanctified. We're temples. We're a branch of the true vine. We have such these positive identities that Christ has given us. And I say that I think a lot of those identities we hear, but we don't believe because we find ourselves unworthy to carry that identity. But again, the point isn't that your identity is now drawn from your character and your history. It's drawn from his character and his history of the cross and the resurrection. Right? That's the identity we're supposed to be living. I think everybody has like a favorite identity. Mine would be this. Mine would be Victor. I think one of our youth leaders, Victor, thinks it's a subconscious because he thinks he's my favorite youth leader. Maybe he's right, but my favorite identity is Victor. What does that mean to walk in victory, right? You guys ever see I'm sure I know you guys have, at least most of you, but like the Super Bowl victory, right? What happens right after somebody wins the Super Bowl, right? When you watch that team, the confetti's coming down, how are they walking? How are they talking? How's that post-game interview going, right? There's a certain spirit of the way they walking in victory, right? And it's not that, like, you go to the post-game interviews, you see them. Some of the mistakes and the failures they made in the game, right? You'll never find a Super Bowl champion who played a Super Bowl perfectly. There were missed tackles. There were missed blocks. There were interceptions and fumbles, right? They made mistakes, right? They made mistakes. And when they're talking in the post-game interview, they own up and they talk about the mistakes that they made, but that is not what's defining them at that moment. What's defining them in that moment is that they're Super Bowl champions. And you can see that in them, right? That's the way we're supposed to be living, right? But I feel like so many of us, all right, I'm Victor, yep, I'm in victory in Christ, but then Monday morning, we walk out into the world feeling more defeated, where we make Eeyore look like Joel Osteen. You know what I mean? And my point is that our youth are coming up seeing a generation of where they draw identity. And we're not providing, I just feel like we're not providing them the example of a complete identity. So their identity is incomplete, and they're searching the world to define the rest of that for them. Does that make sense? It does. This is a unique generation. Our second observation was that it's a generation vastly lacking identity. But the third is this. As a youth team, we feel like this generation is vastly lacking leadership. And I feel like this is on a national sense, right? Imagine your only two presidential campaigns that you've ever witnessed were the last two. Right? Think about that. Right? Think about the insanity of those last two presidential campaigns. That's their context of trust and faith in government and politics, right? So in a very national sense, I think this is true, but I would say it's even true locally within the schools. To an extent, I would even say within the American church, but also, I would say primarily in the home. This is a generation desperate, absolutely desperate for leadership. They want to be discipled. A couple months ago, we were in a series called Courageous Youth. And what we were really doing was just taking some profiles of teenagers in the Bible, some of their failures, but also some good success stories. And there was this one in particular week where I had multiple youth come up to me right after and throughout that week, and they had told me, what you taught on Sunday seems to describe the way I feel about my situation perfectly. And why that's a big deal, at least to me, is if you want to know what it's like to go teach youth on a Sunday morning, like if you feel like, hey, I want to train for it, go home, get a chair, put it up against a wall, and then teach a Bible study. That's what it's like. That's about the amount of feedback you get, right? So for having multiple youth coming up, tell me how much that this had spoke to them in their situation. The teaching was on David and Goliath, but not the week of what you would generally think of David and Goliath. What we were talking about was the actual tragedy behind that whole story. It was the tragedy behind the story of David and Goliath. And I just want to kind of go through the quick points of what they heard so you know. The first tragedy of that story was that David was fighting a fight that he had no business fighting. He was about 15 to 17 years old, they think, about 15 to 17 years old when he fought Goliath. The whole nation was at war. And not just at war, but Goliath was the champion for the opposing army. He shows up just to deliver some cheese and bread to his brothers and kind of sees, like, what's going on? Everyone's just standing around, right? And he hears their champion come out and mock not just Israel, but mock their God. He's like, is somebody going to do something about this? Yep. And all the men, particularly the men of that generation, because they didn't have enough assurance in their own identity of who they were as belonging to Israel and being one of God's chosen people, because they didn't have the faith, and in their own cowardice, they failed to fight the fight that they should have fought. So it required a teenager to step in and fight the fight that adults should have been fighting. That's tragedy number one. The second tragedy was not only did he end up ultimately fighting the fight that he shouldn't be fighting, but they allowed him to. Yeah. They allowed this teenager to go fight this fight. And not only did they allow it, the third tragedy is that they actually encouraged them to. They bring him in and they say, hey, here's a bunch of armor and equipment. Well, let me equip you for the fight that I should be fighting. There's this whole narrative of King Saul dressing him up. You find this whole story, by the way, in 1 Samuel 17. So you have this whole narrative of King Saul giving and trying to equip David to fight the fight that he should have been fighting. And we do that even in our own homes, where we say, I'm not going to fight this fight for you. Instead, I'm going to spend my time and energy just trying to equip you to go fight the fight I should be fighting. Yep. And that's what's happened. Because the front lines right now is in your middle schools, your high schools, and your colleges. Good preaching. Yep. We are saying, we'll equip you to go fight the fight that I should be fighting. So he fought a fight he had no business really fighting. The adults allowed a child to go fight it. They, in fact, encouraged him to go fight it. But I think the most tragic thing of that whole story, and this is the one I think that resonated with most of the youth when I taught it, was that it wasn't just that he had to go fight this fight he shouldn't have been fighting, but he had to go fight it alone. He was there fighting this fight alone. Even Goliath brought a shield bearer to the fight. But this teenager had to go out and fight this fight alone. Can I just tell you, because I don't know what your relationships are with them, but our youth are engaged in a lot of battle every single day. The amount of courage required from them on a daily basis just to stand faithful to faith is far more demanding than it ever was for me at that age. And I can almost guarantee it's far more demanding than you're experiencing on a daily basis, even in the Marine Corps. They are having to go into battle, and they are fighting a lot of battles. There's a lot of battles they should not be fighting. No teenager should have to be working a job to sustain, to make ends meet for their family because their dad can't get his gambling and alcohol problem under control. They're fighting that battle. These teenagers are fighting battles where they're going home, having to raise their siblings because mom and dad are passed out high on the couch. So they're having to cook dinner, siblings, and do their homework and try to get through high school, right? They are fighting battles they should not be having to fight. So they're lacking this leadership. But I kind of want to end, though, with something positive, because I know that was kind of very gleam, right? Regardless of if they should be fighting the battles they're fighting, the truth is they're fighting battles. And I think an overlooked element of this generation that they never get credit for, because you'll never hear it on Fox News or Twitter or X or whatever it's called, wherever you get your news, is that this is a fighting generation. This generation is a generation that has a lot of fight in them. When I was kind of reflecting on this particular point, this story kept coming to me out of 1 Kings 19, and I felt like I had to include it. But in 1 Kings 19 tells the story of a prophet, Elijah. And Elijah has been in battle to Baal for a while. And he just came off this massive victory at Mount Carmel, where God calls down fire on the altar. They end up slaying about 500 of the priests of Baal. This incredible spiritual victory for Elijah. He's been engaging, of his generation, he's been engaging in this spiritual warfare. Well, after that victory, the political authorities of Israel didn't take too kindly to it and essentially promised that they're going to go kill Elijah. They're like, no, you're done. We're coming to kill you. So Elijah ends up kind of going on the run. And over in that chapter, you hear this kind of same passage from Elijah. He says, I am the only one, speaking of his own generation, I am the only one. I am the only one who loves God. I'm the only one who is remaining faithful to God. I'm the only one who cares about honoring God. But then God kind of comes in with this little reprimand. He says, hey, I have reserved for me 7,000 who have not bent the knee to Baal. Right? Now, I don't know if we got 7,000, but I can tell you this. We have about 40 youth down in that Joshua house every Sunday who have not bent the knee to the Baals of this world. Amen. And you see it, right? Amen. We have, let me give you a few examples. We had a youth, this was in the last school year. She had to write, I think it was an argumentative paper, and then provide a presentation for it. And she took a stand for truth. She took a stand for truth. She ended up getting essentially ostracized and humiliated by her teacher in front of all of her peers for the position she took. And this kind of crushed her. For a couple weeks, it was just waterworks. A couple weeks. Go to check in with her about, just a couple weeks after this had to happen, to say, hey, where are you out? And she's like, oh, well, it is what it is, but I got this new assignment coming up. And I asked her, well, what are you doing for that assignment? And she chose to take another stand of truth of something even more controversial, right? So it crushed her, but it did not crush the zeal and the passion and the love she has for Jesus. You don't hear that, right, out of Fox News about this generation. We had this other youth. This was right after youth camp, this last youth camp that we went for winter. She comes back. She's all on fire. She has this our youth hoodie. It said "Made and Saved to Purpose" on the back. You may have seen them around. She's not with us anymore. Navy PCS them out, but she's at school right after camp, and there's a teacher and another student there, and they see the hoodie, and they start asking her about things of faith, and she's like, "Oh yeah," and going on about camp, and she's just all on fire. And the way she put it was that the teacher began to politely mock her. That affirmative mocking of, hey, you are such a young, beautiful, intelligent, strong young woman. You don't need to be your answers there. Science provides that for you. You can find your answers there. Use your brain, your intelligent brain. You're still smart. Don't be stupid with that, right? And I was just, kind of like, I can't believe teachers are doing this, right? So then I asked her, I said, well, how did you respond to this? She's like, oh, I just shrugged. And I told her, understanding the theory of gravity didn't comfort me when my dad left me, but Jesus did. And she said, I walked away, right? Right? You're seeing this every day there. You look across, today's Youth Sunday, you see the youth back there in the media, but they're always back there. Right? That's actually nothing really unique to Youth Sunday. They're serving back there every single Sunday. You walk around in first service here, you're seeing youth serving in nursery. We put on this phenomenal VBS this summer, I thought. Ashley and Darrell Burke, they did this phenomenal VBS for the church. And one thing I was proud of is when I showed up, how much of our youth were engaged in teaching the younger children at VBS. My point is this, is that things are not great for this generation. And am I saying that they're not struggling? They're struggling with identity. They're fighting battles, and there are a lot of them they're fighting alone, but they are fighting. I am excited for this generation to come up and start taking over leadership positions in the church. Because they have such a unique context, such a fresh take of the gospel that they're going to be able to benefit all of us. I think one of the biggest mistakes we think in terms of multi-generationally is that the older generations think that there's nothing to learn from the younger. And I can't wait for them to start filling in and start leading certain ministries in church, because they're going to be able to provide and teach us so much, because they have a context that we never had. It's going to be amazing. For those who are in faith of that generation, I'm telling you, it is a sincere, legitimate faith, because it's not hidden by things that we had, right? We're not in this great economic, compared to the world we are, we're still a blessed nation, but we don't have the same stability now that I did growing up, right? So it was very easy in a lot of regards to come into faith. It's not as easy for them. So when they come up, it's going to be something that is far more sincere and genuine, because it costs them more to be in faith than it costs me to come into faith. I can't wait for them to come up. And I just want to encourage you all too, you're raising good kids. You're raising great kids. I don't want you to think anything I said here was a was speaking to failures of you, but it is speaking to, I think, corporate problems of that generation. Does that make sense? So what I want to do, I want to do something kind of special, or not special, but unique. And worship team, you can come on up. I first want to kind of give just a general invitation to the altar, because some of you may be thinking like, okay, great, about that generation, but I'm not youth anymore. I don't have youth in the home. And I don't think you necessarily have to, because I think some of you may be looking up and saying, I think my identity isn't complete in Christ. I think I was one of those that was falling into just that one factor. I've only been deriving my identity in Christ from one of those factors. Come up and start reforming and transforming that identity now. The second thing I would say is, just because you're not in youth doesn't mean you're not fighting your own battles. And I would also say that a lot of your battles, you're also fighting alone, right? Men, just personal experience, it is very difficult to fight that battle with porn by yourself. Military spouses, it's very hard to deal with that deployment when your spouse is gone by yourself, right? You have battles that you are still fighting by yourself. And I want you to know that as a church, you do not fight those alone. You're going to have people up here who are going to be able to pray with you. You can kneel down at the altar and hand it over to God. But what I want to specifically do, and I specifically asked, not initially, Lorenda actually said, hey, we shouldn't have the youth come up for the invitation. I said, no, put them up there. And then I called her back. I'm like, hey, no, take them back down. Always just listen to the initial intuition of a woman, right, men? But we kept the youth off for this invitation because I want to offer you all an opportunity. If you are here with your youth, I want to offer you the opportunity to come and pray with them at the altar. I want to offer you the opportunity for you to pray over their battles, to get in the trenches and say, I am not going to let you fight your battles alone. And for some of you, you may be like, well, I don't really know what their battles are. Maybe that's been some of your conviction this morning. That's okay. Just pray over them. Love them in prayer. I have my youngest son, Ollie, he fractured his wrist this week. That was a couple nights ago, but I went and I said, hey, let's pray over your wrist. I was putting him to bed. I prayed over his wrist, and it just stuck with me, because when I got done praying with him, I looked at his face and the smile and how loved he felt with just dad praying over him. That's good. Right? I don't think, there's no, I think, better way to express the love you have for your children than to pray with them. So I want to offer that opportunity here. Pray over them. Let them know you're willing to get in the trenches and fight that fight. If that is a little uncomfortable or awkward for you, because maybe hasn't been normal for you, I still want to offer you the opportunity to come out and pray with Pastor Grover, pray with myself. We will pray with you and your family, because I want you to start praying. Because I want to kind of leave you with this last kind of story. About once a month, we try to break into small groups in youth where we talk through each other's situations, pray through each other's situations. And this was very recently. It was the last time or the time before we did it. But one of the young men in our youth, when we were asking for prayer and what you want to be prayed over for, this is what he said. He said, I want you to pray that my family starts to pray together the way we pray together here. And at first, I was like, man, that's amazing, great prayer, right? But that stuck with me for that whole week, because it kind of broke my heart. Because what he is desperately lacking and wanting in his family is that leadership to pray together, to get in the trenches with him. Amen? So I want to offer you that opportunity here. I'll be here to pray with you. Pastor Grover and Melinda can also pray with you. But really, if you have youth here, take them, bring them to the altar, and pray with them. Pray over your youth this morning. Amen? All right, would you stand?
Thank you for listening to the sermon. For further information or to get in contact with our church's ministries, please visit us at palmsbaptistchurch.com.